Welcome, everybody. I've been doing a lot of interviews lately on other shows, many of which are going to be released soon. Some are already out, like I was on the Tom Hartman program earlier this week. And one of the big questions that I'm asked related to my book is to talk about the core ways in which MAGA politics aren't good for the average American. And in the book, I talk about how we got to this point. In the interviews, I'm talking about the policies today or lack thereof from this modern Republican Party that really just have nothing to offer for the average American. I'm not that good at explaining that compared to Senator Bernie Sanders. Senator Bernie Sanders laid out yesterday in speaking with our friend Ben Meiselas from Midas Touch. Bernie really lays out in the clearest possible terms why MAGA politics are a disaster. It's not about the old disagreements with Republicans about what should the top tax rate be, for example. It is a different sort of animal. And this is not about Donald Trump's latest trial. It's not some culture war distraction. Bernie really lays out that the politics of the MAGA Republican Party, as compared to what people like he and others are proposing, are really the difference between life and death when you look at life expectancy. So he's going to lay it out here. It's really a brutal indictment of what Trump and far-right economics have done to the United States. And Bernie points out that Americans now live, on average, 4 years less than people in other wealthy nations. Think about that for a second. 4 years gone. And why? Because we have a political movement that prioritizes billionaire tax cuts over healthcare, that is open to gutting social programs while handing corporations blank checks, and that treats workers as disposable while pretending to be all about Americans. So Bernie says it way better than I can. Let's take a listen.
And here is the reality, which is not talked about very much. The reality is that in America today, our life expectancy is about 4 years less than other wealthy countries. But even worse is the fact that if you're working class in America, on average, you live 7 to 8 years shorter life than people who are wealthy. Now, why is that? And the answer is not just healthcare, which is important. Working class people, low income people do not have access to the kind of healthcare that the rich do, but it is the stress, the day-to-day stress that working class people live under. And I grew up in a working class home. I know a little bit about what it's like to have a family living paycheck to paycheck. And what I did, that was in Altoona, Wisconsin. I said, okay, all right, tell me what it's like to live under economic stress. And people just stood up. And one woman says, it's a question of whether I buy shoes for myself or my kids, whether I can afford eyeglasses, whether I can afford to go to the doctor, whether, I'm going to have the money to prepare a decent meal for my kids, that I live every day not knowing, what to expect. How do I survive? And what that is about, that is the reality that tens of millions of our people are living under. We don't talk about it. And what I have learned over the years, that some of the most important issues are the issues that get least discussion. And one of those issues is not just the working class people live 6 years shorter lives, 7 years shorter lives than the rich. That's important. Why is that? But what's equally important is 60% of the American people in the richest country on earth live paycheck to paycheck.
So this is the real failure of Trumpism, yes, as a conclusion to 40, 50 years of this sort of thinking. But it's not just the corruption. It's not just the criminality of Trump. It's the fact that their policies are literally killing people or causing people to die sooner than they otherwise would. And the worst part is that MAGA voters are actually some of the ones suffering the most from these failures, because as I've talked about before, if you look at states and rank states, the blue states that are doing best have quality of life and life expectancy and sort of metrics similar to places like Norway and Sweden and Denmark. And on the other hand, states like Mississippi and Louisiana and Arkansas, which have been disproportionately devastated by this sort of politics, have quality of life and what we call HDI, Human Development Index numbers, that are more similar to countries that we don't typically aspire to be. The folks in those red states, the Trump voters, are the ones with the skyrocketing healthcare costs and the lower wages and the crumbling infrastructure that red states refuse to invest in for the benefit of their own people. And maybe the most tragic part of this is that Trump and his movement have really convinced them that the real enemy is immigrants or trans people or some university professor in California who's teaching something they don't like. And it's part of the snow job that they've done to continue pitting people against each other on these contrived issues, while the big picture is life expectancy declining and all of these systemic problems that Bernie talks about. Now, in the next segment, we're going to briefly look at Senator Bernie Sanders calls out the kind of ridiculous apathy towards the suffering of federal workers that are being crushed by Trump and Musk and Doge. Some are suffering job insecurity, some wage stagnation, some threats to their pensions because of the MAGA-driven chaos. Let's take a listen.
Number one, of course, what you're seeing precisely is that attitude now being reflected in what Musk is doing to the federal government. Oh, you work for the federal government for 20 years? You're gone. We don't need you anymore. You have a poor performance. Who determined that? Well, I did. I never met you. I never saw you. I never talked to you. You're gone. So that is precisely what they're doing. And I want to say this. I know there are people out there who say, well, it's really unfortunate what's happening to these federal employees. People like Musk are great believers in technology, artificial intelligence, and robotics. And when that revolution sweeps across the private sector and threatens the jobs of tens of millions of workers, you know what the Musks of the world are going to say? You're out of here. Have a nice day. Goodbye.
That is not just an American problem. I mean, what Bernie is talking about there, this playbook, funnel money to the rich, destroy social programs, distract the public with endless culture war nonsense. This is being used by reactionaries worldwide. The UK conservative implosion, the authoritarian drift in Hungary and in other places. The failures of this ideology are visible in many parts of the world, and Bernie's absolutely right. This is what they offer. It's more suffering, lower life expectancy, more inequality, fewer years of life working productively, and fewer years of life living as well. Excellent, excellent takedown. Bernie's really good at this, and he's going to be doing this at some town hall events alongside AOC.